They laughed at the $9 rope bridge she built to the silo. Harlan Voss, who had survived 11 Dakota winters running freight, told her plainly, "Your boys will freeze looking at your firewood from a window." She had $12, two boys, and no way to reach the silo once drifts closed in. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. But 4 months earlier, Ragna Tveit had never rigged a tension line in her life. She had arrived in Dakota Territory in the August of 1887 with a husband who could set stone, two boys who could carry water, and a wagon that held everything they had managed to save from 6 years of Wisconsin wages. The land was flat and treeless in a way that made the sky feel like a weight pressing down. Ragna Tveit stood at the edge of their quarter section on that first afternoon and watched the grass bend under wind that had nothing to stop it for 100 miles in any direction. Peter had already started talking about the silo. He was a mason by trade and a dreamer by temperament, and he saw the stone outcropping near the creek as a gift. Most Dakota homesteaders built with sod or shipped lumber. Peter wanted to build with what the land offered. A tower, he said, 12 feet across at the base, rising 18 feet to a capped platform, stone walls 2 feet thick at the bottom, tapering to 16 inches at the top, cool in summer, dry in winter, a place to store fodder and provisions away from the house, where a chimney spark could not reach them, and where vermin would find the walls too thick to breach. Ragna had listened to him describe it 3 times before they even finished unloading the wagon. She had learned, in 6 years of marriage, that Peter's plans were like weather. They arrived whether you were ready or not. The only question was whether you positioned yourself to survive them. The cabin came first. They raised the frame in September with help from 2 neighboring families who expected the same help returned when their own walls went up. Sod bricks packed the gaps. A second story went on before frost, more loft than proper floor, but it gave them sleeping space above the single room where the stove lived. The boys shared a rope bed under the eaves. Ragna and Peter took the corner where the chimney kept the wall warm. By October, Peter had the silo foundation dug and the first courses of stone laid. He worked before dawn and after supper, fitting rocks by lantern light, while Ragna hauled mortar sand from the creek bed in a handcart. The neighbors thought he was building a well house. When Marta Ellingson rode over to return a borrowed needle and saw the walls rising past her head, she asked if Peter was constructing a fortress against the Sioux. "A tower," Ragna said, "for storage." Marta looked at the partially framed house, the open yard, the single mule switching flies by the creek. "Storage?" she repeated in the tone of someone too polite to say what she was thinking. But the silo rose. By late October, the walls reached 12 feet. Peter had set iron anchor bolts into the top course for the platform frame. He talked about completing the cap before first snow, building an interior ladder, fitting a hatch that could seal against weather. He talked about it at breakfast. He talked about it while Ragna mended his work gloves. He talked about it in bed, his voice going soft and certain in the dark, describing how they would lower barrels through the hatch and stack provisions in the cool stone belly where no blizzard could reach them. On the 3rd day of November, 1887, Peter took the wagon to town for lime and iron fittings. The road crossed a washed-out gully 3 miles from the homestead, where spring floods had carved the bank into a lip of crumbling earth. The mule balked at the crossing. Peter climbed down to lead it. The bank gave way. Ragna learned what happened from a freight driver who found the wreck an hour later. The wagon had rolled. Peter was underneath it, one leg crushed from knee to hip, the bone showing white through torn flesh. The freight driver and his partner lifted the wagon off him and loaded him into their own rig. They brought him home that afternoon, already gray-faced and sweating, the leg wrapped in a shirt that had soaked through twice. The nearest doctor was in Brookings, 18 miles east. Ragna sent Niels running to the Ellingson place with a message while she boiled water and tore sheets into bandages. She cleaned the wound as best she could. She set the bone by feel, the way her mother had once set a calf's leg in the old country, working by touch because she could not bear to look at what her hands were doing. Pater did not scream. He had passed out before she started. Marta arrived at dusk with her husband and a bottle of whiskey. They spelled Ragna through the night, keeping the fire high, and the compresses changed. By morning, the leg had begun to swell in a way that made Marta's husband step outside and stand in the yard for a long time without speaking. The doctor came on the fourth day. He examined the leg, pressed the flesh above the break, watched the color that bloomed under his fingers. Then he took Ragna into the yard and told her what she already knew. "Infections in the bone," he said. "I can take the leg. Might save him, might not. Or you can keep him comfortable and let it run its course." "How long?" Ragna asked. "A week, maybe less." She paid the doctor with money from the coffee tin where Pater kept their savings. $22 for a visit that told her nothing she had not already seen in the black streaks climbing her husband's thigh. Pater died on November 11th, 1887. He was conscious at the end. He held Ragna's hand and told her to finish the silo. He told her the boys would need the storage space come winter. He told her he was sorry about the gully, about the wagon, about all the plans he was leaving half-built. Ragna buried him on the rise behind the cabin where the wind kept the snow thin and the ground would be easier to find come spring. Marta helped her dig. The boys carried stones for the cairn. She was 31 years old. She had $12.60 in cash, a partial credit note at Creed's store in town, one lame mule, and a silo that stood 18 feet tall with no cap, no hatch, no ladder, and no way to reach the provisions it was built to protect. Winter was 7 weeks away. The first visitor after the burial was not a neighbor. Harlan Voss rode in on a Tuesday morning when the frost was still white on the grass, and the boys were hauling water from the creek in buckets too heavy for their arms. He was a lean man in his 50s, face weathered to leather, hands scarred from years of working freight lines in country that killed draft animals and men with equal indifference. He had survived 11 Dakota winters between Brookings and De Smet. He had lost 3 oxen in the October blizzard of 1880 and walked the last 9 miles home through drifts that reached his chest. People in the territory said Harlan Voss could read weather and farm failure better than most county officials. They said this with respect. They also said it with a certain wariness, because Harlan's readings were almost never wrong, and they were almost never kind. He dismounted at the edge of the yard and stood looking at the property for a long moment before he spoke. He looked at the cabin with its half-chinked walls. He looked at the silo rising beside it, stone walls solid, but the top open to the sky. He looked at the wood pile against the eastern wall of the house, split logs stacked maybe 4 feet high and 8 feet long. "Mrs. Tavite," he said without turning. "I knew your husband. Worked a freight run with him 2 years back, before he got the claim. He was a good man with stone." Ragna came down from the cabin step. The boys had stopped hauling water and were watching from the creek bank, buckets hanging from their hands. "I remember," she said. "He spoke of you." Harlan walked to the woodpile. He paced its length, counting under his breath. Then he turned and walked to the silo, circling the base, running his hand along the mortar joints. He looked up at the open top where the platform should have been. "You have maybe a cord and a half here," he said, nodding at the woodpile. "Call it generous, say 2 cords. You need 5 minimum to come through honest. 6 if January goes hard like it did in '83. Ragna did not answer. She had done the same calculation 3 times since the burial. "That mule!" Harlan pointed at the animal grazing near the creek, favoring its left foreleg where an old injury had never healed right. "Can it haul?" "Short distances, not far, not heavy." "Then it cannot drag enough timber in time." Harlan looked at the silo again. "Your husband's tower. He meant to store provisions in there?" "Fodder, flour, water barrels, whatever needed to stay dry and cool." Smart thinking. Stone holds temperature better than wood, keeps vermin out if you seal it right. He paused. But that top is open. And even if it were capped, how do you plan to reach what's inside once the drifts come? Ragna said nothing. Harlan walked back toward her, his boots crunching on the frozen grass. He stopped close enough that she could see the old frostbite scars on his cheeks, white patches where the skin had died and healed thin. Mrs. Tveit, I'm going to tell you what I see, because no one else will say it plain. You have a framed house that's not properly chinked. You have a wood supply that's short by 3 cords minimum. You have a stone tower with no cap and no access. You have 2 boys under 10, a lame mule, and no team, no hired hand, and no lumber money to build enclosed passage between your structures before deep winter. He let that settle. The wind picked up, pushing dry grass across the yard in waves. The first real blow will drift your yard shut, he continued. When that happens, your first floor door will not open. You will be trapped inside while your supplies sit 30 feet away in a tower you cannot reach. If the cold holds long enough, you will burn through whatever wood is stacked against the house. And when that runs out, he stopped, looked at the boys by the creek, looked back at Ragna. When that runs out, your boys will freeze to death looking at your firewood from a window. The words hung in the air between them. Ragna felt her chest tighten, not from grief this time, but from something colder. Harlan Voss was not being cruel. He was being accurate, and accuracy in this country was the cruelest thing a person could offer. What do you suggest? She asked, keeping her voice level. Sell the claim. Take whatever you can get. Move to town before the first snow and find work until spring. You can try again next year with proper supplies, or you can take the money east and forget this place ever held your name. And if I stay? Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Not pity, not quite. Something closer to recognition. Then you had better find a way to do what I just told you cannot be done, he said, because the weather will not wait for you to figure it out. He mounted his horse. Before he rode out of the yard, he turned back. I will check on you after first snow, he said, if you are still here. He did not say what he expected to find. He did not need to. Ragna spent the next 3 days doing mathematics. She sat at the rough table Pater had built, a candle burning low beside her, and scratched figures into a slate with a piece of chalk. She calculated wood consumption per week based on the stove they had. She calculated the walking distance from cabin to silo, 34 feet, she measured it with a knotted rope, and the likely drift height based on what Marta's husband had described from previous winters. She calculated the cost of lumber for an enclosed ground passage between the buildings and compared it to the $12.60 she had left. The numbers did not work. A proper covered walkway would require posts, framing, and roof boards. Even using scrap lumber and salvage, she would need at least $35 in materials. She had 12. Creed might extend credit, but Creed held the note on her existing debt, and Creed had made it clear at the funeral that he expected payment by spring. She could sell the mule. That might bring $10, maybe $12 if she found the right buyer, but then she would have no way to haul anything, not wood, not water, not the provisions she needed to move into the silo before the ground froze solid. She could ask the neighbors for help. But the Ellingsons were burning through their own wood supply trying to finish their barn before winter. The Hendricksons 2 miles north had lost a child to fever in September and barely had labor enough to keep their own claim running. No one had surplus to spare for a widow who had arrived in August and lost her husband before Thanksgiving. The boys watched her from the loft, their faces pale ovals in the candlelight. Niels, the older one, had started taking on Pater's habits, checking the mule's leg each morning, stacking kindling by the stove without being asked. Eli, the younger, had not spoken more than a dozen words since the burial. He followed his brother like a shadow and slept with his father's work gloves under his pillow. On the 3rd night, Ragna pushed the slate away and went outside. The sky was clear, the stars hard and bright overhead. The wind had died to a whisper. She could see her breath, but the cold had not yet turned bitter. A few more weeks, maybe. A month if the weather held mild. But Harlan Voss had survived 11 winters in this country, and Harlan Voss had looked at her woodpile and seen a grave. She walked to the silo. The stone walls rose around her, solid and dark. Pater had built well. The mortar joints were tight. The walls curved slightly inward as they rose, the way he had learned from watching German immigrant masons in Wisconsin. At the top, the platform frame jutted out like a skeletal crown. The boards Pater had been fitting when he made his last trip to town still lashed to the frame with rope. She put her hand on the stone. It was cold, but not wet. The surface was rough under her palm. 34 feet from the house, 34 feet that might as well be 34 miles when the drifts rose high enough to seal the doors. Ragna looked up at the open top of the silo. Then she looked back at the cabin, at the second-floor window that glowed faint with candlelight where the boys had left a lamp burning. The second floor. She stood very still, her breath clouding in the dark. When she was a girl in Wisconsin, she had watched her father, a stonemason and winter teamster like Petter, deal with a lake-effect storm that dropped 4 feet of snow in 2 days. The drifts had sealed the barn doors. The yard between house and outbuildings had become impassable. She remembered standing at the window, watching her father and her uncle carry lanterns through the snow, their shapes disappearing and reappearing as the wind shifted. What she remembered most was what came after. Her father had lashed a walkway between the barn loft and the granary loft, a narrow plank bridge with rope railings strung 20 feet above the buried yard. She remembered watching him cross it, his silhouette moving against the white sky, carrying hay bales on his shoulders, while the ground below was a frozen sea of drift. She remembered asking him why he had built it up there instead of digging a path. "Snow buries the ground," he had said, his accent thick, his hands cracked from the cold. "Snow does not bury the air." Snow does not bury the air. Ragna looked at the cabin. The second-floor window was nearly level with the top of the silo. The span between them was 34 feet of open yard, but it was 34 feet of air, not ground. If the drifts rose 8 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet against the walls, the air above them would still be clear. A bridge, not on the ground, above it. The idea arrived complete, the way her father's stories had always arrived, not as pieces to be assembled, but as pictures already whole. She could see it, a narrow passage stretched between her loft window and the silo platform, wrapped against the wind, anchored at both ends. Not a walkway for fair weather, a lifeline for blizzards, a way to reach the tower when the ground root disappeared. It was insane. It was dangerous. It would require materials she did not have and skills she had never learned. But Harlan Voss had told her that her boys would freeze looking at their firewood from a window, and she could not make that picture leave her mind. She told no one what she was planning. She told Niels they were going to finish his father's tower. She told Eli they were going to build something that would keep them safe. She did not tell them about the bridge, because she did not yet know if a bridge was possible, and she had learned from Pater that you did not promise children things you could not deliver. On the first morning, she climbed the ladder to the silo platform frame and examined the anchor points Pater had set. Iron bolts driven into the stone, 4 of them spaced around the circumference. They were meant to hold the platform beams, but she could see now that they could hold other things too. Rope, cable, tension lines. She measured the span with her knotted rope, standing at the silo top and sighting toward the cabin's second-floor window. 34 feet, give or take a foot, nearly level. If she strung a line from one to the other, it would sag in the middle, but not by much. Not if the line was tight enough. Not if she anchored it right. She climbed down and walked into town. Creed's store sat at the end of Main Street, a two-story frame building with a false front that made it look taller than it was. Amos Creed himself stood behind the counter, a heavy man in his 40s with small eyes and a calculating smile that never quite reached them. He had come to Dakota from Ohio 10 years earlier with capital saved from a failed dry goods operation, and he had learned quickly that the real money on the frontier was not in farming, but in lending to farmers. He held notes on half the claims in the county. He had a reputation for patience. He would extend credit freely, add interest monthly, and wait for the inevitable default that gave him the land at a fraction of its value. Ragna knew all this. Everyone knew it. But Creed's store was the only place within 20 miles that sold rope and hardware. Mrs. Tveit. Creed's smile widened when she walked in. My condolences again on your loss. Pater was a fine man, a fine man. I need rope, Ragna said. Good rope. Hemp or manila, not cotton. Enough to span 40 feet with surplus for anchoring. Creed's eyebrows rose slightly. Rope. Interesting. What sort of project calls for 40 feet of line? 40 feet plus anchoring, so 60 feet total, maybe more. That's considerable. Creed moved to the back of the store where the hardware and rigging supplies were kept. I have some hemp in stock. 3/4 inch, rated for heavy load. $2 for 30 feet. I need 60. $4 then. He laid the coils on the counter. Anything else? Ragna looked at the shelves behind him. Eye bolts, washers, spikes. The hardware she would need to anchor the bridge to the house. The cabin timbers were not as solid as the silo stone, and she would need to distribute the load across multiple points. Eye bolts, she said. 4, and washers to match, and spikes, the long ones, for timber. Creed gathered the items, setting each on the counter with a small click. Eye bolts, washers, spikes. Running a ferry line across your property? Something like that. That will be, let me see, $4 for the rope, 50 cents for the eye bolts and hardware, another 30 cents for the spikes. $4.80 total. Ragna pulled the money from her coat pocket. She had counted it 3 times that morning. $12.60. After this purchase, she would have $7.80. Creed watched her count out the coins. His smile had not changed, but something in his eyes had sharpened. You know, he said, as she pushed the money across the counter, if you're building some sort of passage between your buildings, I can sell you proper lumber on credit. Posts, beams, roofing boards, a real covered walkway, the kind that will last. I don't need lumber. Rope won't hold through a Dakota winter, Mrs. Tveit. First heavy snow, first hard wind, and whatever you've strung will come apart. Then where will you be? I will manage. With 2 boys? Alone? Creed leaned forward on the counter. I'm not trying to sell you something you don't need. I'm trying to help you survive until spring. Your husband, rest his soul. He had vision, but vision doesn't keep a family warm. Proper construction does. You take that rope home, string it up however you're planning, and when it fails, you come back here and we'll talk about real materials. I'll extend the credit. We'll work something out. Ragna gathered the rope and hardware into her arms. I'll take what I paid for. As you wish. Creed's smile did not waver. But Mrs. Tveit, this country doesn't reward stubbornness. It rewards people who know when to accept help. She walked out without answering, but she could feel his eyes on her back all the way to the door, and she knew what he was thinking. He was thinking about her claim. He was thinking about spring. He was thinking about paper moving faster than mules, the way debt always moved faster than hope in a country that killed hope for sport. The practical objection came 3 days later. Marta Ellingson rode over on a gray morning when the clouds sat low enough to touch, and the wind smelled like iron. The smell Ragna's father had called snow waiting. Marta tied her horse at the rail and stood in the yard, watching Ragna climb the ladder to the silo top with a coil of rope over her shoulder. "What in God's name are you doing?" Ragna did not stop climbing. "Finishing my husband's tower." "With rope? You're running line from that window to the silo?" "Yes." Marta was quiet for a long moment. When Ragna reached the platform frame and turned to look down, she saw Marta standing with her arms crossed, her face caught between confusion and concern. "Ragna, come down here." Ragna climbed down. "Now tell me," Marta said, "what exactly you think you're building?" Ragna told her. The bridge. The logic. The span from loft to silo top, wrapped against the wind, anchored at both ends. A way to reach supplies when the ground root disappeared. Marta listened without interrupting. When Ragna finished, she shook her head slowly. "Even if it stands in calm weather," she said, "what happens when the wind takes it sideways with a child on it?" "I'll brace it." "How? You're one woman. You can't hold tension on a line from both ends at once." "I'll set the line tight. I'll let the rawhide shrink as it dries." "Rawhide?" Marta's voice was flat. "You're building a rope bridge in a blizzard country, and you're betting your children's lives on rawhide and knots." "I'm betting their lives on not being able to reach the silo when the drifts close us in." Ragna kept her voice steady. "Harlan Voss came by last week. He looked at my woodpile, looked at the silo, and told me my boys would freeze to death looking at their firewood from a window. He said I should sell the claim and move to town." "Maybe he's right." "Maybe he is, but if I sell, I get $40 for a quarter section my husband died building. I go to town with 2 boys and no trade and no prospects, and $40 that will last until February if we're careful. Then what? Who hires a widow with 2 children? Where do we go when the money runs out?" Marta had no answer for that. "If I stay," Ragna continued, "I might fail. The bridge might collapse. The winter might be worse than I can manage. But if I stay, I keep the land. I keep the silo my husband built. I keep the chance that next year, with a proper supply of wood and the tower finished, I can make this claim work. And if the bridge doesn't hold, then my boys die, and I die with them, and Amos Creed gets the land in spring the way he was going to get it anyway." The wind picked up, pushing dry grass across the yard. Marta looked at the silo, at the cabin, at the span of air between them. "You're mad," she said finally. "But you're not stupid. How wide is this bridge you're planning?" 22 inches. Wide enough to carry a sack of wood, narrow enough to wrap against the wind. "And the slats? What holds them?" "I'll tie them at intervals to the main line. If one breaks, the others hold." "The covering?" "Hides. Old canvas. Straw packed between layers to break the wind." Marta was quiet again. Ragna could see her working through the design, testing it against the winters she had known, measuring it against everything she understood about this country and what it could do to a structure, a plan, a life. "It might work," Marta said at last, "in a mild storm, in a moderate drift, but you've never seen what January can do here. The wind doesn't just blow, it shakes. Everything vibrates, everything twists. Whatever you build will be tested in ways you can't imagine until you're in the middle of it. Then I'll build it to be tested." "How?" "You've never rigged an elevated walkway. You've never set tension lines. You don't know what you don't know." "Then I'll learn." Marta shook her head. But Ragna saw something in her eyes that had not been there before. Not belief exactly, but something close. A recognition that desperation sometimes produced solutions that reason could not. "If you need old grain sacks," Marta said. I have some in the barn, and twine. I have twine I can spare. That would help. I'm not saying I think this will work. I'm saying I'll bring what I can. She mounted her horse. Before she rode away, she looked back at the silo, at the cabin, at the impossible span between them. Your husband, she said. He talked about that tower like it was going to save your life someday. I thought he was dreaming. He was. Maybe. Marta gathered her reins. But maybe that's not the worst thing a man can do. Dream something and leave it for someone else to finish. Amos Creed came on a Friday. Ragna was setting the first main line when she heard his wagon on the road. She had spent 2 days boring through the cabin timbers, fitting interior braces so the pull of the line would not tear the wall apart. She had traded butter and 2 hens to the blacksmith in town for eye bolts and washers, custom work that the man had done after hours because he felt sorry for her and would not admit it. She had threaded the first rope through the loft window, run it to the silo top, and begun the delicate work of tensioning it against the stone anchors Peter had set. The line was not yet tight. It sagged in the middle, drooping toward the yard in a lazy curve that made the whole structure look as fragile as it was. But it was there. It was beginning. Creed's wagon stopped at the edge of the property. He climbed down slowly, deliberately, letting her see him approach. The boys were inside working on math slates Ragna had set for them to keep them occupied. She did not call them out. Mrs. Tveit. Creed walked to the center of the yard and stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking up at the line that stretched from cabin to silo. Building a clothes line, are we? Ragna continued working. She was adjusting the tension on the secondary line, pulling it taut with a lever stick braced against the window frame. A clothes line that runs to your silo, Creed continued. Interesting choice. Most folks hang their washing closer to the house. I'm not hanging washing. No? Then what exactly is that supposed to be? Ragna did not answer. She knew he would not understand, and she knew explaining would only give him ammunition. Whatever she said, he would turn it into evidence of her incompetence, her desperation, her inevitable failure. Creed walked closer, examining the anchor points at the silo base, the rigging that ran up the stone wall to the platform frame. He was a practical man in his own way, and she could see him calculating, not the engineering, which he did not understand, but the cost. The rope, the hardware, the labor. The time a widow was spending on something that looked, to his eyes, like lunacy. I heard in town, he said, that you came in for 60 feet of line and enough hardware to rig a freight hoist. People are talking. They're saying you're building something strange out here. People talk. They do. They say Ragna Tveit is stringing up a washing line to heaven. They say the widow's lost her mind from grief, and she's nailing weather to a rope. He laughed. It was a small sound, controlled. The laugh of a man who wanted you to know he was amused, but not so amused that he had lost track of business. I didn't come to mock you, he said. I came because I hold paper on this claim, and what you do with the property affects my investment. Now Ragna stopped working. She turned to face him, the lever stick still in her hand. Your investment. The note. The credit I extended to your husband for seed and supplies. Due in full by April. $47 with interest. You remember? I remember. Good. Creed stepped closer. Because I want you to understand something, Mrs. Tveit. Whatever you're building up there, this bridge, this contraption, whatever you want to call it, it won't change what's coming. Winter arrives whether you're ready or not, and when winter arrives, paper moves. Buyers don't pay fair for damaged claims. They pay fair for productive claims, clean claims, claims that have been maintained by someone who knows what they're doing. He let that settle. The wind pushed at the sagging rope, making it sway gently between the two anchor points. If you're still here in April and you can't pay what you owe, I take the claim. That's the law. That's the contract your husband signed. And I don't want to take your claim, Mrs. Tivate. I really don't. But I will, because that's what happens when people can't meet their obligations. I'll pay what I owe. With what? You have $12. You had $12 a week ago, and now you have less because you've been buying rope and hardware for a project that anyone with sense can see will fail. The first norther will shake that thing apart, and when it does, where will you be? Trapped in a cabin with 2 boys and a woodpile that won't last till February. Ragna tightened her grip on the lever stick. Is there something specific you want, Mr. Creed? I told you, I'm offering help. Lumber on credit. A real covered walkway, ground level, properly framed. Something that will actually survive. You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to bet everything on a rope bridge that everyone in the county is already calling a fool's errand. I didn't ask for your help. No, you didn't. But you'll need it. And when you do, when that rope comes down and you're standing in your yard with nothing but snow and regret, I want you to remember that I offered. I want you to remember that you had a choice. He turned and walked back to his wagon. Before he climbed up, he looked back at her, silhouetted against the gray sky. I've seen this before, he said. Stubborn people, hard winners, claims that should have been sold in October. It always ends the same way. Paper moves faster than mules, Mrs. Tveit. And paper always wins. He drove away. Ragna stood in the yard for a long time after he left, the lever stick still in her hand, the rope still sagging above her. The boys' faces appeared in the cabin window, watching. She did not wave to them. She did not move. She was thinking about what Creed had said, about paper moving faster than mules, about stubbornness and winter and choices that ended the same way they always ended. But she was also thinking about what he did not understand. He thought she was building the bridge because she had no other option. He thought it was desperation, last resort, a gamble made by someone who could not see clearly. He did not understand that she saw clearer than she ever had. This bridge was not just survival. It was refusal. Refusal to sell. Refusal to leave. Refusal to let Amos Creed take the land her husband had died building. If she failed, Creed got what he wanted. If she succeeded, she kept everything. The math was simple. The execution was not. She went back to work. Have you ever built something that everyone told you would fail? Tell us in the comments. What did you finish that no one believed in? The man who would teach her arrived on foot. It was the second week of November, 10 days after Creed's visit. Ragna was fitting the first slats to the main line when she heard footsteps on the road. Not a horse, not a wagon, just boots on frozen earth, coming slow and steady from the east. Bernd Solheim walked into the yard with a canvas sack over one shoulder and a wool coat that had seen better decades. He was 58 years old, Norwegian-born like Ragna's father, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same stone he used to work. He stopped at the edge of the property and stood looking at the half-built bridge, at the line stretching between cabin and silo, at the woman fitting boards to rope in the cold November light. That angle is too low, he said, without introduction. Ragna turned. What? Your main line. The angle from the window to the silo cap. It's too low. When snow loads the middle section, it will sag. When it sags, you lose clearance above the drift. And if you lose clearance, I know what happens if I lose clearance. Bernd walked closer, studying the rigging. Who set these anchors? My husband, before he died. He was a mason? Stonemason and teamster, like my father. Bernd looked at her. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless in the gray light, the eyes of a man who had spent too many years squinting at stone in bright sun. I worked the railroad bridges, he said. The Eastern Expansion, before the companies went broke, set stone piers in rivers that wanted to kill me and strung tension lines across gaps that made surveyors sick to look at. I know what holds and what breaks. Your husband's anchors are good. He spread the load right. The bolts are deep. The stone will take the strain. But your angle is wrong. If you don't correct it before first hard snow, you will lose everything you've built. And who are you to tell me this? Someone looking for work. Burnt set down his canvas sack. I had a kiln job in town. It fell through. The man who was supposed to pay me left for Sioux Falls without settling accounts. I need wages or food or shelter, and I prefer to earn any of those rather than beg. Ragna studied him. He did not look desperate exactly, but there was a steadiness to him that spoke of long practice in not expecting kindness from the world. I can't pay wages, she said. I have $7 to my name and 2 boys to feed through winter. Then food or shelter, or both, if the work justifies it. He nodded at the bridge. You're building something no one around here has tried. You're building it alone, with no proper equipment, against a deadline you cannot extend. I can help you get the angle right. I can show you how to set tension so the line holds under load. I can teach you the things I learned killing myself on railroad contracts so that when the storm comes, and it will come, your bridge does not kill you instead. Why would you do that? Because I recognize something. Burnt looked at the silo, at the cabin, at the span between them. I recognize someone who has looked at a problem and seen a solution that everyone else thinks is madness. I have been that person. I know what it costs, and I know that sometimes the mad solution is the only one that works. Ragna said nothing for a long moment. The wind pushed at her hair, pulled strands loose from the knot at the back of her neck. What would you want in exchange? Food when you have it, a place by the fire when the worst nights come. And if I work well, if I teach you what I know, then perhaps you tell someone else what you learned. Perhaps this bridge you're building becomes something more than one widow's gamble. Perhaps it becomes something other people can use. He met her eyes. There was no pity in his gaze, no charity, just the practical recognition of one competent person meeting another. I can spare food, Ragna said, and there is space in the barn that can be warmed with proper bedding. It is not much. It is enough. She extended her hand. He took it. His grip was firm and dry, the grip of a man who had held tension lines in storms that killed lesser workers. Show me what's wrong with my angle, she said. Burnt's first lesson came that afternoon. They stood at the cabin window, looking at the line that stretched to the silo. The sag was visible now that Ragna knew to look for it, a gentle dip in the middle section that had seemed minor before, but now looked like a flaw that could kill. Imagine the line loaded with snow, Burnt said. Wet snow, heavy snow, the kind that settles and compresses instead of blowing free. It adds weight to every foot of span. The line stretches. The slats pull downward. The sag increases. If your drift rises 8 feet and your line sags 3, you have 5 feet of clearance. Enough, maybe. But if your drift rises 10 feet and your line sags 4, then I'm crawling. Or not crossing at all, and not crossing is dying. He pointed at the anchor point on the cabin side. You need to raise your starting position. The angle should carry the load toward the silo, not settle into the middle. Water runs downhill, so does weight. You want the weight running toward your stronger anchor, the stone, not pooling at the midpoint where you have nothing but rope to hold it. How much higher? 2 feet, maybe 3. Enough that even a loaded line still clears a 10-foot drift with room to stand. Ragna looked at the window frame. The sill was solid, but the frame itself was pine, and pine did not hold anchors the way oak or stone did. If she raised the angle, she would need to move the attachment point higher on the wall into the timber framing above the window. That meant new holes, new bracing, more work. Can it be done before first snow? It can be done in 4 days if we work through dusk and start at dawn. It can be done in 2 if your boys can carry materials and you do not sleep. Ragna turned and called down to Niels. He appeared at the foot of the ladder, looking up with eyes that had seen too much in the months since his father's death. "I need you to help us," she said. "You and Eli both. Can you do that?" Niels nodded. He did not ask what they were building. He did not ask why. He simply climbed the ladder and stood beside his mother, waiting for instruction. Bernd looked at the boy, then at Ragna. Something passed across his face. Not softness, not quite, but something close to respect. "Good," he said. "We start now." The next 10 days were the hardest work Ragna had ever done. Bernd taught by doing. He showed her how to bore through the cabin's upper framing without cracking the timber, angle the auger shallow at first, then steepen once you've started the hole. He showed her how to fit a bolt so that the strain distributed across the grain instead of splitting it. He showed her the trick with wet rawhide that her father had probably known, but never explained. Soak it until it's pliable. Wrap it tight around a joint, let it dry, and watch it shrink until the connection is tighter than any knot could be. He showed her how to think about wind. "Wind is not just pressure," he said, standing on the silo platform as another November gust pushed at them both. "Wind is vibration. Wind is repeated stress. A bridge can hold a static load 5 times heavier than a load that shakes. You see a line and think of weight. I see a line and think of how many times it will be shaken in a single hour of storm. That is what breaks things. Not the single blow, but the 1,000 small blows that come after." So how do I build for that? You brace, you tie off. You give the bridge ways to move without coming apart. A stiff structure breaks. A structure with flex survives. But too much flex and you have a rope that swings instead of a walkway that holds. The balance is everything. And finding the balance is not something I can teach you. You will feel it, or you will not. There is no other way to learn. The boys worked alongside them. Niels carried boards up the ladder and held them steady while Ragna tied. Eli gathered willow saplings from the creek bank, armloads of thin branches that Bernd bent into hoops for the covering frame. They did not complain. They did not ask why. They worked because their mother was working, and because a stranger who spoke Norwegian like their grandfather had come to help, and because something in the air had changed, some quality of light or temperature that made even a 6-year-old understand that time was running out. On the 3rd day, Ragna made her first mistake. She was tensioning the adjusted main line, pulling it taut with the mule's harness, while Bernd watched from the silo top. The line had stretched overnight, as new rope always did, and she was taking up the slack with the lever system Bernd had shown her. Push the bar, gain an inch, tie off, push again. The bar slipped. The line recoiled. The end whipped back and caught her across the forearm, opening a gash that bled freely down her hand and into the frozen dirt. She did not cry out. She stood holding her arm, watching the blood drip, and felt something shift inside her. Not despair. Something colder and more useful. "Wrap it," Bernd called down. "Tight. Keep working." She wrapped it. She kept working. But she learned the lesson he had not spoken aloud. The bridge would hurt her before it saved her. And the only question was whether she could endure enough pain to finish before the weather made finishing impossible. By the end of November, the main structure was complete. 2 tension lines stretched from the cabin's upper wall to the iron anchors on the silo platform, 22 inches apart, tight enough to barely sag under Ragna's weight when she tested them. Between them, plank slats tied at intervals, each one secured with knots that Bernd had made her practice until she could tie them in the dark. Above the slats, a row of willow hoops bent to form the skeleton of a covering tunnel. The hoops were not yet wrapped. That work would come in the final week. But the shape was there, skeletal and strange against the gray November sky. From the ground, it looked like a ghost trying to escape the house. Ragna Tveit built herself a clothesline to heaven, one of the men at Creed's store said, laughing. His voice carried to where Ragna stood at the counter, buying the last of the twine she needed. She did not respond. She paid for her purchase and walked out. Let them laugh. Let them tell stories about the widow who had lost her mind. By the time the first real storm came, she would have her answer, and no amount of laughter would change what the bridge could or could not do. The wrapping went on in the first week of December. Hides from the buffalo robe Peter had bought their first year in Wisconsin, worn thin in places but still windproof where it counted. Old canvas that Marta had brought over, silent and grim-faced, because she still did not believe the bridge would work, but could not bear to see Ragna fail for want of material. Straw packed between the layers, tamped down by the boys while Ragna and Bernd lashed the covering to the hoops with cord that Bernd had waxed against moisture. This will not hold forever, Bernd said on the afternoon they finished the outer layer. Every storm will take something. A lashing will break. A hide will tear. The wind will find a seam and work it open. You will spend every winter repairing what the weather destroys. I know. You will curse this bridge. You will crawl through it in the dark with ice in your hair and wish you had never built it. Probably. Bernd looked at her. The pale eyes held something new, a warmth that had not been there when he arrived. It is a good bridge, he said. Not perfect, not elegant, but good. It will hold because you built it to hold, and it will save your life because you made it your own. He did not say more. He did not need to. By the third week of December, the passage was complete. Ragna stood at the silo end and looked back toward the cabin. The bridge stretched between them, a wrapped tube of hide and canvas and rope, swaying slightly in the wind. The slats were solid underfoot. The handrails, added at Bernt's insistence, gave her something to grip as she moved. The covering cut the wind to a whisper, even on days when gusts made the main lines drum like harp strings. 22 inches wide, roughly 5 feet of headroom, low enough that she had to stoop, but high enough to carry a load on her shoulders. 34 feet long, from loft window to silo platform. Total cash spent, $9.40, including the rope, the hardware, and the materials Creed had sold her with that smile that never reached his eyes. The hallway, Eli called it, the first full sentence he had spoken since his father's funeral. Mama built a hallway in the sky. Niels said nothing, but he helped his mother test it, crossing with sacks of turnips, then wood, then water in a bucket that sloshed against his legs. The bridge held. The slats did not crack. The lashings did not fail. Marta came over and watched from the yard. Harlan Voss rode by on his way to town and stopped his horse at the fence line, studying the strange structure that connected the widow's house to the widow's tower. Well, he said finally, I told you to find a way to do what I said could not be done. You did. I did not think you would build a covered rope bridge. He shook his head slowly. I've never seen anything like it. I do not know if it will hold in a real blow, but I admit, Mrs. Tveit, you have surprised me. Wait until the storm, Ragna said, then tell me if I surprised you. Harlan looked at her. Something in his face had changed, the wariness replaced by something that might have been respect. I will, he said, if you're still here. He rode on. December passed in a haze of preparation. Ragna moved supplies into the silo, split firewood, stacked in courses against the stone wall, water barrels wrapped in straw to slow the freeze, flour and salt pork and beans and lard, everything that could spoil or be ruined if trapped in the cabin during a long blow. The bridge carried it all, load after load, trip after trip, the slats creaking under the weight, but holding, always holding. The boys learned to cross without fear. Niels could make the passage in under a minute, even carrying a sack of kindling. Eli still moved slowly, one hand on the guide rope, the other clutching whatever he was carrying, but he moved. He did not hesitate at the window. He did not cry when the wind made the covering flap. Burnt watched it all with the expression of a man seeing something he had helped create but no longer owned. He slept in the barn, as agreed, and took meals with the family, but Rajna could see him already pulling back, already preparing for the departure that both of them knew was coming. "You will not be here for the test," she said one evening when the boys had gone to bed and the fire was burning low. "I should not be here for the test." Burnt looked into the flames. "The bridge is yours, not mine. What you learn from it must be your learning. If I am here holding your hand, telling you what to do, then it is not your bridge. It is still mine." "That is a strange philosophy." "It is the truth. Every bridge I ever built, I had to let go eventually. I had to trust that the stone would hold, the line would bear, the structure would stand without me there to watch it. The hard part is not the building. The hard part is the walking away." He left 3 days before Christmas. Ragna watched him go, his canvas sack over his shoulder, his boots crunching on the frozen road. He did not look back. She did not call after him, but she stood at the window until he disappeared over the rise, and she kept standing there long after the road was empty and the cold had crept into her bones. The bridge swayed gently in the wind. The silo stood solid against the gray December sky, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a cold front was building that would test everything she had built, everything she had learned, and everything she had become. She did not know when the storm would come. She only knew that when it did, she would be ready, or she would not. The new year arrived without celebration. Ragna marked January 1st, 1888, by carrying an extra load of kindling across the bridge before dawn. The boys slept in the loft, wrapped in quilts that still smelled faintly of their father's tobacco, and she moved through the dark hallway of hide and rope with the practiced ease of someone who had made the crossing 100 times. The slats were familiar under her boots now. The guide ropes fit her palms like old tools. She no longer counted her steps or held her breath at the midpoint where the sag was deepest. The bridge had become part of her body, an extension of her reach, a second set of arms that could touch the silo when the rest of her stood in the cabin. She emerged onto the stone platform and lowered the kindling through the hatch. Below, in the cool, dark belly of the tower, her winter lay stacked and waiting, 4 cords of split wood arranged in courses against the curved wall, water barrels lined in a row with straw packed between them, sacks of flour and beans hanging from hooks that Pater had set before he died. The silo smelled of dry stone and cedar shavings and the particular stillness of air that has not moved in weeks. She climbed down and checked the barrels. Ice had formed at the rims, thin sheets that cracked under her knuckle, but the water beneath was still liquid. The stone held temperature the way Pater had promised. The walls breathed cold, but not killing cold. Whatever she stored here would last. She climbed back up, crossed the bridge, and found Niels awake at the cabin window, watching her. "How much is left?" he asked. "Enough." She pulled herself through the window frame and stamped the cold from her boots. 4 cords in the tower, Another cord against the house. If we are careful, we'll see April. And if we are not careful, Ragna looked at her son, 9 years old, already speaking like a man who understood that careful was not always enough. Then we will learn to be more careful, she said. Now wake your brother. We have work. The first week of January brought weather that felt like a taunt. Temperatures climbed into the 20s, then the 30s. Snow that had fallen in December began to soften at the edges. Icicles dripped from the cabin eaves. The road to town turned to mud, and the mud froze overnight into ruts that could break a wagon axle. Harlan Voss rode by on January 4th and stopped at the fence. Warm spell, he said, looking at the sky. Enjoy it while it lasts. You think it will not last. I know it will not last. He shifted in his saddle, favoring the hip that had never healed right after the 80 blizzard. This is thaw before blow. The pressure is wrong. The clouds are wrong. Something is building north of here, and when it arrives, it will arrive fast. How fast? Fast enough that if you are in town when it hits, you will not make it home. Fast enough that if you are in the yard when it hits, you may not make it to the door. He looked at the bridge, swaying gently between cabin and silo. I hope that contraption holds, because if it does not, you will not get a second chance to build it. He rode on without saying goodbye. Ragna stood in the yard and watched him go. The sun was warm on her face. The snow was melting. The air smelled like spring, like possibility, like the lie that January always told before it remembered what it was. She went inside and began moving supplies. For the next 3 days, she worked as if the storm were already visible on the horizon. She moved the last of the flour from the cabin to the silo. She checked every lashing on the bridge, tightening the ones that had loosened, replacing the rawhide strips that had frayed. She taught Niels how to light the silo's small iron brazier that Bernd had helped her install, a safety measure, a way to warm the tower's interior if they were ever trapped there instead of the cabin. She made the boys practice crossing in the dark. Why? Eli asked, his voice small in the black hallway of the bridge. Why can we not use the lantern? Because the lantern can blow out. Because your hands might be full. Because in a storm there is no light, and you must know the way by feel. She stood at the cabin end and listened to their footsteps on the slats. Niels confident, Eli hesitant but steady. She counted the seconds. She made them do it again, and again, and again, until both boys could cross without stumbling, without pausing, without crying out when the wind made the covering flap against their shoulders. Good, she said, when they emerged onto the silo platform for the 5th time. Now we do it carrying weight. Niels groaned. Eli said nothing, but they did it. On January 8th, Marta Ellingson came to visit. She arrived on foot, her horse having thrown a shoe 2 days earlier, and she stood in the yard looking at the bridge with an expression Ragna had not seen before. Not skepticism, not concern, something closer to wonder. You finished it, Marta said. I finished it. And it holds? It holds. Come see. Ragna led her up to the loft and showed her the entrance. The window frame reinforced with extra bracing, the anchor points bolted through the timber, the first slats of the bridge disappearing into the wrapped tunnel that stretched toward the silo. Marta put her hand on the main line and felt the tension. She tugged. The line did not give. It is tight. Bernd taught me how to set it. The angle runs slightly downhill toward the silo, so the weight of anyone crossing pulls toward the stronger anchor instead of sagging into the middle. Bernd, the old Norwegian who came through last month? Railroad bridge worker. He saw what I was building and told me my angle was wrong. He stayed 3 weeks and taught me what he knew. Marta was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something Ragna did not expect. She climbed through the window and onto the bridge. Marta, hush, I want to see. Ragna watched her neighbor move along the slats, one hand on the guide rope, her body hunched against the low ceiling of the covering. The hide and canvas muffled the sound of her footsteps. The bridge swayed, but only slightly, less than it had in November, before the raw hide had fully dried and tightened. Marta reached the silo platform and looked back. Her face was pale but composed. "It is narrow," she called, "and dark, and I do not like the way it moves." "But you made it across." "I made it across." She climbed down the silo ladder, and Ragna heard her footsteps on the stone floor below, exploring the stored supplies. When she climbed back up and crossed the bridge again, her expression had changed. "How much do you have in there?" "4 cords. Water for 2 weeks, flour, beans, salt pork, lard. Enough to survive if the cabin becomes inaccessible." "Enough to survive?" Marta reached the cabin window and pulled herself through. She was breathing hard, but not from exertion. "Ragna, I told you this was madness. I told you it would not work. I told you the wind would take it apart, and your children would die looking at supplies they could not reach." "You did." "I was wrong." Marta's voice cracked. "I was wrong, and I am sorry. I should have helped more. I should have done more than bring sacks and twine. I should have believed you." Ragna took her neighbor's hand. "You helped. That was enough." "It was not enough. It was not nearly enough." Marta wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "When the storm comes, and it will come, you know it will, I want you to know that I will be watching. I will be watching from my window, and I will be praying that your bridge holds. Because if it holds, you will have done something no one else in this territory has thought to do. And if it holds, maybe others can learn." She left before Ragna could respond, but she came back the next day with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil. "Measurements," she said. "I want to know how you built it, the span, the angle, the anchor points. If this works, if this really works, my husband needs to know. The Hendricksons need to know. Everyone who has ever lost a winter crossing their own yard needs to know." Ragna gave her the measurements. Marta wrote them down, her handwriting cramped and careful, the paper smudged with stove soot from her own cabin. "Thank you," Marta said, folding the paper and tucking it into her coat. "Thank me after the storm," Ragna said. "Thank me when we know if it holds." On January 11th, Eli woke with a fever. Ragna noticed it at breakfast, the flush on his cheeks, the way he picked at his porridge without eating, the glassy look in his eyes that meant something was building inside him that had nothing to do with weather. She put her hand on his forehead and felt the heat radiating through his skin. "Does your throat hurt?" He nodded. "Your chest?" He coughed instead of answering, a deep barking sound that came from somewhere below his ribs. Ragna felt the cold settle into her stomach, a different kind of cold than the one outside. Fever was common in winter. Children got sick, recovered, got sick again. But fever in a blizzard was different. Fever in a blizzard meant a child who could not be moved, could not be bundled onto a wagon and driven to town, could not be kept warm by anything except the constant work of carrying fuel and water and heat from one place to another. She put Eli back to bed. She built up the fire. She made him drink willow bark tea, the bitter brew her mother had taught her to make for fevers in the old country. Then she went to the window and looked at the sky. The clouds had changed. They were no longer the soft gray of winter overcast. They had thickened, lowered, taken on a yellowish cast that made the light feel wrong. The wind had shifted too, still mild, still carrying the false warmth of the thaw, but with a new edge underneath, a pressure that made her ears feel full. Harlan Voss's words came back to her. Thaw before blow. The pressure is wrong. Something is building. She checked the bridge. She checked the silo. She checked the wood stacked against the cabin wall and the water bucket by the stove and the blankets piled on the boy's bed. Then she made Niels cross the bridge with her, one more time, carrying nothing. If something happens tonight, she said, standing on the silo platform with her older son, I need you to know you can make this crossing alone, even if I am not with you, even if it is dark and the wind is screaming and you are afraid. Can you do that? Niels looked at her. His father's eyes, she thought, the same steady gaze that had looked at a stone outcropping and seen a tower. I can do it, he said. Promise me. I promise. They crossed back together. The bridge held. The covering flapped in a gust that came from nowhere and disappeared just as fast. That night, Eli's cough worsened. Ragnar sat beside his bed, listening to him breathe, watching the firelight play across his flushed face. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window frames. The temperature began to drop. She did not sleep. January 12th, 1888, began like a gift. The morning light was warm. The snow on the ground glistened with melt. The sky had cleared overnight, and the sun rose into a blue so bright it hurt to look at. Ragnar stepped outside at dawn and stood in the yard, breathing air that felt like April instead of January. Eli's fever had not broken, but it had not worsened either. He was sleeping now, his breathing ragged but steady, the cough quieter than it had been in the night. Niels sat beside him, reading from a primer that Pater had brought from Wisconsin, his voice soft and careful. Ragnar decided to make one more supply run. She crossed the bridge with a bucket, filled it from the water barrel in the silo, and carried it back. She crossed again with an armload of kindling. She crossed a third time with a sack of flour, smaller than she would have liked, but enough to last another week if they were careful. By mid-morning, the wind had shifted. She noticed it first as a sound, not a gust, but a pressure, a weight in the air that made her ears pop. The sky was still blue, but the blue had taken on a strange quality, a brightness that seemed to come from everywhere at once instead of from the sun alone. Then the temperature began to fall, not slowly, not the gradual cooling of a normal day's end. The temperature dropped like something falling off a cliff, plunging from the 30s into the 20s, then the teens, then lower still. In the space of an hour, the melt on the ground had refrozen. The icicles on the eaves had stopped dripping and begun to grow. Ragnar went inside and fed the fire. By noon, the wind had arrived. It came from the northwest, a wall of air so cold it felt like a physical blow. The cabin shuddered. The windows, which had been letting in pale winter light, went dark as something outside blocked the sun. Snow that had been lying on the ground began to rise, lifted by the wind and driven sideways in sheets that turned the yard white. Ragnar looked out the window. She could not see the silo. She could not see anything beyond the glass except white, moving white, a chaos of ice and air that erased the world. Mama? Niels's voice came from the loft. Mama, Eli is coughing again. She climbed the ladder. Eli was sitting up, his face pale, his body shaking with coughs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. The fire had warmed the main room, but the loft was cold, too cold, the heat rising but not holding against the draft that crept through every seam in the walls. She checked the wood beside the stove, half a cord, maybe less. She checked the water bucket, nearly empty. She went to the first floor door and pushed. It did not move. She pushed harder, throwing her weight against the planks. The door shifted, opened perhaps 2 inches, then stopped. Through the gap she could see only white, packed white, the compressed surface of a drift that had already risen past the handle. The first floor was sealed. She climbed back to the loft and looked out the window. The bridge was still there, a dark shape barely visible through the driving snow. The covering was intact, though she could see it flexing and billowing as the wind found its seams. Eli coughed again. The sound was wet now, congested, the sound of a child whose lungs were filling with something that should not be there. She needed water. She needed wood. She needed to keep the fire burning and her son warm and her family alive until the storm passed. The bridge was the only way. She dressed for the crossing as if dressing for battle. 2 coats, layered, a scarf wrapped around her face until only her eyes showed. Mittens over gloves, the mittens lined with rabbit fur that Peter had bought their first winter in Wisconsin. She tied a rope around her waist, knotting the other end to the bedpost where Eli lay shivering. "If I am not back in 10 minutes," she told Niels, "pull the rope. Pull it as hard as you can. Do you understand?" He nodded. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. 10 minutes. I will pull." She climbed through the window and onto the bridge. The wind hit her immediately, a force that made her stagger against the guide rope. The covering flapped wildly, snapping against the hoops, and she could feel the whole structure swaying beneath her feet. But the slats held. The main lines held. The anchors that Burnt had helped her set, the angle he had made her correct, they were doing what they were supposed to do. She moved forward. The crossing that had taken 30 seconds in calm weather took 3 minutes in the storm. Every step was a negotiation between her weight, the wind, and the bridge's movement. Snow drove through the seams in the covering, stinging her eyes, filling her nose, turning the inside of the passage into a howling white tunnel. At the midpoint, where the sag was deepest, she felt the slats shift beneath her boots. One of them cracked. She heard it, a sharp sound swallowed instantly by the wind, but it did not break through. The secondary lashings held, the load distributed. She kept moving. She reached the silo platform and dropped through the hatch. Below, in the stone belly of the tower, the world was suddenly still. The wind was a distant roar, muffled by 2 feet of rock. The temperature was cold, but not killing. The walls held their breath, holding the air steady. Her supplies waited in the dark, wood stacked against the curve, water barrels lined in a row, everything she needed to survive. She filled a kettle from the barrel. The ice at the rim cracked and fell away. The water beneath was liquid, cold, but drinkable. She shouldered an armload of kindling, as much as she could carry with one hand while holding the kettle with the other. She climbed back up. The crossing was harder with the load. The wind seemed to know she was burdened, and it pushed against her with new force. The covering, which had kept most of the snow out on her first crossing, had torn at one seam. Ice crystals drove through the gap, coating her face, freezing her eyelashes shut. She moved blind for the last 10 feet, feeling her way along the guide rope, trusting her feet to find the slats. She reached the window. Neil's hands grabbed the kindling. She pulled herself through, gasping, and collapsed on the loft floor with the kettle still in her grip. "Mama?" Eli's voice, weak but present. "Mama, are you hurt?" She was not hurt. She was exhausted, frozen, her lungs burning from the cold air she had swallowed. But she was not hurt, and she had water, and she had wood, and she could do this again. She would have to do this again. She made the crossing 4 more times that afternoon. Each trip brought something essential: wood for the fire, water for drinking, and for the compresses she laid on Eli's forehead, a crock of lard that she melted into broth to ease his cough. Each trip tested the bridge in new ways, the wind shifting, the covering tearing, the slats groaning under loads they had been built to carry, but had never been asked to carry in conditions like these. On the 3rd crossing, she heard a sound that stopped her heart. One of the side lashings snapped. She was at the midpoint, carrying a sack of split wood, when the rope gave way with a crack like a gunshot. The bridge lurched sideways. Her feet slipped on the slats. For one terrible moment she was falling, the sack tumbling from her grip, her hands scrabbling for the guide rope that seemed to have moved somewhere she could not reach. And then she caught it. Her mittened hand closed on the rough hemp, and she pulled herself upright, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart slamming against her ribs. The bridge was still swaying, still shuddering, but it had not collapsed. One lashing had failed. The others held. She left the sack where it had fallen, wedged between two slats, not lost, and finished the crossing empty-handed. She would come back for it. She would come back for everything. But first she had to know that the bridge was still sound, that the failure of one rope had not started a cascade that would bring the whole structure down. It had not. She examined the anchor points from the cabin window. The main lines were still taut. The hoops were still in place. The covering had torn further. A whole panel of hide was flapping free now, snapping in the wind like a flag, but the skeleton beneath was intact. Burnt's voice came back to her. A structure with flex survives. But too much flex and you have a rope that swings instead of a walkway that holds. The bridge was flexing. The bridge was losing pieces. But it was not breaking. It was shedding what it could afford to lose and holding what it could not. She cut the flapping hide free rather than let it drag the whole span. She retrieved the sack of wood. She made 2 more crossings before dark, each one harder than the last, each one proving that the bridge was still there, still working, still doing what she had built it to do. If you're still here, if you need to know whether she makes it through the night, hit subscribe and stay with us. Because what happens next changes everything. Night fell like a door slamming shut. The temperature, which had already dropped 40 degrees since morning, kept falling. By dusk it had passed 0. By full dark it had reached 10 below. By midnight, when Ragna finally allowed herself to rest, the thermometer Peder had nailed to the cabin wall read 17 degrees below 0, and the wind had not slowed. Eli's fever spiked at 9 o'clock. She held him through the worst of it, his small body burning against hers, his coughs coming so fast and hard that she feared he would not be able to draw breath between them. She fed him sips of water, spoonfuls of the lard broth, doses of willow bark tea that he swallowed without complaint. She kept the fire high. She kept the blankets piled around him. She did everything her mother had taught her to do for a sick child, and she prayed to a God she was not sure was listening that it would be enough. At 11 o'clock, she made another crossing. She did not want to. Her body ached in ways she had never felt before, shoulders screaming from the weight of the loads, hands raw inside her gloves, lungs tight from the cold air she had been breathing all day. But the wood beside the stove was running low again, and Eli needed the heat, and stopping meant dying. She tied the rope around her waist. She told Niels to pull if she did not return in 10 minutes. She climbed through the window and onto the bridge. The crossing in darkness was different. She could not see the slats. She could not see the guide ropes. She could not see anything except the faint glow of the cabin window behind her and the absolute black of the storm ahead. The wind screamed through the gaps in the covering, and the cold bit through her layers, and she moved by feel alone, hands on the rope, feet finding the slats, body bent against the force that wanted to tear her off the bridge and throw her into the drift below. Burnt's voice. Always make one-handed travel possible. Build touch points into the passage for use in dark or panic. She had built them. She had tied knots at intervals along the guide rope, knots she could feel through her mittens, knots that told her how far she had come and how far she had to go. She counted them as she moved. 1, 2, 3, 4, midpoint. 5, 6, 7, 8. Almost there. She reached the silo platform and dropped through the hatch. The darkness below was total. She found the wood by feel, loading her arms until she could carry no more. She found the kettle she had left on an earlier trip and filled it from the barrel. She climbed back up. She crossed back. Niels was waiting at the window, the rope in his hands, his face white in the firelight. "You were gone 12 minutes," he said. "I know, I am sorry. I almost pulled." "I know." She climbed through the window and dumped the wood beside the stove. "But I came back. I will always come back." She did not know if that was true, but she said it anyway, because Niels needed to hear it, and because saying it made it feel more possible. The storm raged through the night and into the next morning. Ragna lost track of how many crossings she made. 6, 7, 8, each one harder than the last, each one revealing new damage to the bridge. Another lashing gone, another seam opened, another piece of covering torn away. By dawn, the passage looked like something that had been through a war, and perhaps it had. But it held. When the first gray light crept through the cabin window, she looked out and saw a world transformed. The drift had risen past the first floor. The cabin door, which she had tried to open the afternoon before, was now buried under 8 feet of packed snow. The yard had become a single white surface, unbroken from house to silo, except for the dark line of the bridge stretching above it. The wind had slowed. The snow had stopped. The temperature had begun, slowly, to climb. And Eli's fever had broken. She found him sleeping, his face cool to the touch, his breathing clear for the first time in 2 days. The coughs had stopped. The flush had faded. He was pale and exhausted, but he was alive, and he was getting better. She sat beside his bed and wept. She wept for Peter, who had built the silo and died before he could see it save his family. She wept for Bernd, who had taught her what she needed to know and walked away before he could see his teaching proven. She wept for herself, for the woman who had stood in this yard 4 months ago with $12 and 2 boys and a future that everyone said was already written. She had rewritten it. The digging out took 3 days. Harlan Voss arrived on the morning of January 15th, leading a team of neighbors who had banded together to check on the isolated claims. He stopped at the edge of Ragna's property and stared at the drift that had buried the cabin to the roofline, and at the bridge that still stretched above it, battered but intact. "Good God," he said. Ragna stood on the silo platform, having crossed the bridge one last time to meet them. Niels stood beside her. Eli was in the cabin, still recovering but strong enough to wave from the loft window. "It held," she said. Harlan dismounted and walked closer, studying the bridge from below. The covering was in tatters. The hoops were bent. One of the main lines had frayed to half its original thickness, but the structure was still there, still connected, still spanning the impossible gap between house and tower. "I told you your boys would freeze looking at their firewood from a window," Harlan said. "You did." "I was wrong." He looked up at her, and something in his face had changed, the wariness replaced by something that might have been wonder. "Mrs. Tveit, I have lived in this territory for 11 years. I have seen blizzards that killed cattle standing in the field. I have seen drifts that buried entire homesteads. I have never seen anything like what you have built here. It is just a bridge." "It is not just a bridge." He turned to the other men who had gathered behind him. "It is a solution. It is something the rest of us should have thought of years ago, and if you are willing to show us how you built it—" "I am willing. Then I believe this territory owes you something more than an apology for doubting you." Marta arrived that afternoon with her piece of paper. She had the measurements Ragna had given her, but she wanted more. the angle of the main lines, the spacing of the slats, the way the covering had been attached to the hoops. She walked the bridge from end to end, asking questions at every step, writing notes in a cramped hand that would take her husband 3 readings to decipher. "The Hendricksons could not open their door until yesterday morning," she said when she had finished her inspection. "They burned every piece of furniture in their cabin to keep warm. Their children ate raw flour mixed with snow because they could not reach the smokehouse." "Are they all right?" "They survived, but barely." Marta looked at the bridge, at the tattered covering, at the main lines that had held through everything the storm had thrown at them. "If they had built something like this, they can build it now, so can you. So can anyone who is willing to learn." "You would teach us." "Bernd taught me. He told me that if this worked, I should tell others what I learned. I intend to keep that promise." Marta folded her paper and tucked it into her coat. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "I called it a clothesline to heaven," she said. "I laughed at you, Ragna. I laughed, and I am sorry. You also brought me sacks and twine when I needed them. That matters more than the laughter." "It does not feel like it matters." "It will. Give it time." The hostile skeptic arrived last. Amos Creed drove his wagon into the yard on January 18th, 3 days after the storm had broken and 2 days after the road had been cleared enough for travel. He stopped at the edge of the property and sat for a long moment, looking at the bridge, at the silo, at the cabin that had survived when so many others had failed. Ragna walked out to meet him. She did not invite him inside. "Mrs. Tveit." His voice was neutral, careful. "I heard about your contraption. My bridge. Your bridge." He climbed down from the wagon. "I also heard that you kept your family alive through the worst 3-day blow this territory has seen in a decade. People are talking about it in town. They're calling it remarkable." "I did what I had to do." "Yes, you did." He looked at the bridge again, and something flickered across his face. Not respect, not quite, but something adjacent to it. "I came to discuss the note." "The note is due in April. I intend to pay it." "I know you do." He pulled a paper from his coat pocket. "I also know that paying it will leave you with nothing for seed, nothing for supplies, nothing to build on next year. You will survive the winter and starve in the summer. That is not a future I want for my investment." Ragna said nothing. She waited. I will take your extension," she said. "But I want you to understand something, Mr. Creed. I did not build that bridge to impress you. I did not build it to save your investment. I built it because my husband died and left me with 2 boys and a tower, and no way to survive the winter without something that had never been built before. You told me paper moves faster than mules. You were wrong. Sometimes people move faster than paper. Sometimes they build things that paper cannot touch." Creed's face did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, a recognition perhaps that the woman standing before him was not the same widow he had tried to frighten in the autumn. "Perhaps," he said, "we will see what the next winter brings." He climbed back onto his wagon and drove away. Ragna stood in the yard, the extension in her hand, and watched him go. The bridge swayed gently above her head. The silo stood solid against the winter sky. And somewhere inside the cabin, her boys were waiting for her, alive and safe and ready for whatever came next. She went inside. The thaw came slowly, the way grief sometimes lifts, not all at once, but in pieces, each day a little lighter than the one before. By late January, the drifts had settled enough that Ragna could see her yard again. The shape of the land had changed. Where there had been flat ground, there were now ridges and hollows carved by the wind, a new geography written in white. But the cabin stood. The silo stood. and the bridge, battered, torn, missing half its covering, still stretched between them, a dark line against the pale sky. She began the repairs on January 22nd. Harlan Voss returned 3 days after his first visit, this time alone. He tied his horse at the fence and walked into the yard, his boots crunching on the crusted snow. Ragna was on the silo platform, examining the anchor points where the main lines attached to the iron bolts Pater had set. One of the bolts had shifted during the storm. Not much, perhaps a quarter inch, but enough that the tension on that side had changed. She would need to reset it before the next blow. Mrs. Tivite. Harlan stopped below the platform and looked up. I wanted to see it again, in daylight, without the emergency. Come up, then. He climbed the ladder and stood beside her on the stone platform. The wind was mild today, barely enough to move the tattered covering that still hung from the bridge's hoops. From up here, they could see the full span. The cabin window 34 feet away, the slats marching between the main lines, the places where the structure had held, and the places where it had given way. Tell me how it works, Harlan said. Not the pieces, the thinking behind it. Ragna pointed at the anchor bolts. The load has to go somewhere. If you anchor to weak points, the load tears them out. If you anchor to strong points and spread the strain, the structure can flex without breaking. Your husband set these bolts? Before he died, he meant them to hold the platform frame. I used them to hold the bridge instead. And the angle? Harlan traced the line from platform to cabin window. It runs slightly downhill toward the silo. So the weight of anyone crossing pulls toward the stronger anchor. Stone holds better than timber. The cabin wall is braced, but the silo is solid. If the bridge sags, the sag should run toward the stone, not away from it. Harlan was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. The man who helped you, the Norwegian, he taught you this? Bernd Solheim. He worked railroad bridges before the companies went broke. He saw what I was building and told me my angle was wrong. He stayed 3 weeks and corrected what needed correcting. Where is he now? He left before Christmas. He said the bridge had to be mine, not his. He said I had to learn what it could do without him standing beside me telling me what to do. Harlan looked at her. The wariness that had marked his face at their first meeting was gone now, replaced by something that might have been respect. He was right, Harlan said, and you were right to listen to him. I have been farming and freighting in this territory for 11 years, Mrs. Tivate. I have seen 100 ways to fail and maybe a dozen ways to survive. I have never seen anyone think the way you think, the way you look at a problem and see something no one else sees. I did not see it. My father saw it first. He built a walkway between buildings after a lake effect storm in Wisconsin when I was a girl. I just remembered what he taught me and applied it to a situation he never imagined. Harlan shook his head slowly. That is not memory, Mrs. Tivite. That is understanding. There is a difference. He climbed down the ladder. Before he left, he turned back. I told everyone in the county that you would fail, he said. I told them a widow with 2 boys and no team could not survive a Dakota winter. I was wrong, and I intend to say so publicly. Whatever help you need rebuilding that bridge, you have only to ask. I do not need charity. It is not charity. It is payment for a lesson I should have learned years ago. He mounted his horse. The ground is not the only way to move. Sometimes the air is better. I will not forget that. He rode away. Ragna watched him go, then turned back to the anchor bolt that needed resetting. She had work to do. The first teaching happened in early February. Marta Ellingson arrived with her husband, a quiet man named Arvid who had spent most of his life letting his wife do the talking. They brought a wagon loaded with materials, rope, canvas, lumber scraps, and a list of questions that Marta had been compiling since the storm. "We want to build one," Marta said, standing in the yard with her paper in hand. "Between our house and the granary, the distance is shorter than yours, maybe 20 feet, but the principle should be the same." "It should." Ragna led them to the silo platform. "But every span is different. The angle depends on your anchor points. The covering depends on your materials. I can show you what I learned, but you will have to adapt it to your own situation." She showed them the anchor bolts, explaining how Peter had set them and how she had repurposed them. She showed them the main lines, demonstrating the tension system Barent had taught her. She showed them the slat spacing, the lashing technique, the way the covering attached to the hoops. Arvid Ellingson said almost nothing, but his hands were busy, touching the ropes, testing the knots, running his fingers along the joints where different materials met. He was a man who learned by feel rather than explanation, and Ragna recognized the type. Her father had been the same way. "The hardest part is the angle," she said, when they had finished the inspection. "If you set it too flat, the line sags under load and you lose clearance above the drift. If you set it too steep, you're climbing instead of walking, and climbing with a load is exhausting." "How do you find the right angle?" Marta asked. "You calculate the likely drift height. You add clearance, enough to stand at minimum, enough to walk upright if you can manage it. Then you set your high anchor point accordingly." She pointed at the cabin window. "I started too low. Bernd made me raise it 2 feet before the first snow. That 2 feet saved the bridge during the storm. If I had kept the original angle, the midpoint would have been buried." Arvid spoke for the first time. "The man who helped you, he knew this from railroad work?" "He set stone piers and strung tension lines across rivers. He said the principles are the same, whether you are spanning water or snow. You find your strong points, you set your angle, and you build for the load you expect plus the load you do not expect. Plus the load you do not expect." Arvid nodded slowly. "That is good thinking." "It is Bernt's thinking. I just applied it." They stayed for 3 hours, asking questions, taking measurements, sketching diagrams on Marta's already crowded paper. When they left, Marta pressed a jar of preserved blackberries into Ragna's hands. "A gift," she said, "for the teaching." "I do not need payment," Ragna said. "It is not payment. It is thanks." Marta's eyes were bright. "You could have kept this to yourself. You could have made people pay to learn what you know. Instead, you are giving it away." "Bernd gave it to me. He told me to pass it on. That is what I am doing." The second teaching happened a week later. This time it was the Hendricksons, the family Marta had mentioned, the ones who had burned their furniture and fed their children raw flour mixed with snow. They arrived on a Sunday morning, the husband gaunt and hollow-eyed, the wife holding an infant wrapped in blankets that had seen better years. 2 older children trailed behind them, silent and watchful. "We heard about your bridge," the husband said. His name was Carl. His voice was hoarse, the voice of a man who had spent 3 days breathing smoke from burning furniture. "We heard it kept you alive when everyone else was trapped." "It helped." "We want to build one, between our cabin and the root cellar. We lost everything in that cellar because we could not reach it. Potatoes, turnips, salt pork, all of it spoiled because we could not get through the drift to check on it." "How far is the span?" 25 feet, maybe 30. "And your anchor points, what do you have to attach to?" Carl described his property, the cabin with its timber frame, the root cellar dug into a hillside with a stone-lined entrance. Ragna listened, asked questions, began to see the problem in her mind. "The cellar entrance is your weak point," she said. "Stone-lined, but the stones are not mortared. If you anchor directly to them, the tension will pull them loose. You need to set a post, A timber post, bury deep, and anchor to that instead. The post takes the strain. The cellar stones stay where they are. A post? Carl looked at his wife. We do not have timber for a post. We burned it all. I have timber. Not much, but enough for one post. You can have it, and you can pay me back when you have something to spare. The wife started to cry. Ragna looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude, and busied herself gathering the materials Carl would need. Rope from her own diminishing supply, a few slats that could be spared from her repair stock, a bundle of rawhide strips that she had been saving for the covering. This is not enough to build a bridge, she said, handing the materials to Carl, but it is enough to start. Come back when you have the post set and I will help you finish. They came back 2 weeks later. Ragna walked them through the construction, step by step, the way Bernd had walked her through the correction of her angle. She showed them how to bore anchor holes without cracking the timber. She showed them how to tension the main lines. She showed them the trick with wet rawhide, the way it shrank as it dried and pulled the joints tighter than any knot could hold. By the end of February, the Hendricksons had a bridge. It was cruder than Ragna's, shorter, narrower, the covering made from old blankets instead of hides. But it worked. It connected their cabin to their root cellar, and when the next snow came, they crossed it without difficulty and retrieved the supplies they needed to survive. Word spread. By March, Ragna had taught 5 families. Each one was different. The Olsons needed a bridge between their house and their barn, a span of 40 feet that required intermediate supports, because no single line could hold that distance without sagging. The Petersons had a unique problem. Their outbuilding was uphill from their cabin, which meant the bridge had to climb instead of descend, and the weight distribution worked differently. The Larsons were building new, constructing their homestead from scratch, and wanted to know how to position their buildings from the start so that a bridge would be possible if they ever needed one. Ragna answered every question. She walked every property. She drew diagrams in the dirt and on scraps of paper, showing angles and anchor points and the logic behind each decision. You should charge for this, Marta said. One afternoon, when they were sitting in Ragna's cabin drinking coffee that had been stretched thin with chicory. You have knowledge that no one else has. People would pay. People cannot pay. They barely have enough to survive. If I charge, the ones who need the knowledge most are the ones who cannot afford it. Then you will exhaust yourself teaching for free while others profit from what you give them. Perhaps. Ragna looked out the window at the bridge, still scarred from the January storm, but rebuilt now, the covering patched with new canvas that Harlan Voss had brought her as his payment for a lesson. But Bernd did not charge me. He came looking for work and stayed to teach me for food and shelter. If he had demanded wages I could not pay, I would have built the bridge wrong, and my boys would be dead. I cannot forget that. You are a better person than I am, Marta said. I am a more stubborn person. There is a difference. Bernd Solheim returned in the second week of March. Ragna heard his footsteps on the road before she saw him, the same slow, steady pace she remembered from November, the pace of a man who had learned to conserve his energy for the work that mattered. She came out of the cabin and stood in the yard as he walked up the path, his canvas sack over his shoulder, his wool coat more ragged than it had been 4 months ago. He looked older. The lines in his face had deepened, and there was a sound in his breathing that had not been there before, a wheeze, a rattle, the sound of lungs that were not working the way they should. Burnt. She did not know what else to say. I did not expect you back. I did not expect to come back. He set down his sack and looked at the bridge. The covering had been repaired, the torn sections replaced with canvas and quilted straw mats. The main lines had been retensioned. The slats had been reinforced where they had cracked during the storm. It held. he said. It held. I heard, in town. People are talking about the widow who built a rope bridge and survived the January blizzard while everyone else was trapped. They're calling it remarkable. He coughed, a deep, wet sound that made Ragna's stomach tighten. I wanted to see it myself. I wanted to see what you did with what I taught you. Come inside. I will make coffee. In a moment. He walked to the silo and climbed the ladder to the platform. Ragna followed, watching him examine the anchor points, the main lines, the repairs she had made. His hands moved over the structure the way a doctor's hands might move over a patient, feeling for weakness, testing for strength. You raised the angle again, he said. 1/2 foot. After the storm, I could see where the sag had been worst. I added clearance. Good. And the slats. You spaced them closer at the midpoint. The cracking happened where the spacing was widest. I tightened it. Also good. He straightened and looked at her. The pale blue eyes were the same, but there was something behind them now. Pride, perhaps, or satisfaction. You learned. You taught me. I showed you principles. You applied them. That is not the same thing. He coughed again, longer this time, and had to brace himself against the silo wall until the fit passed. The design was never the true work, Ragna. The true work was learning to see the storm before it arrived. You saw it. You prepared. And when the storm came, you were ready. I was terrified. Of course you were. Terror and readiness are not opposites. They are companions. He climbed down from the platform. Now, that coffee you mentioned. I have been walking since dawn, and my bones are telling me I am too old for this country. Bernd stayed for 3 weeks. He slept in the barn, as before, but he spent his days working beside Ragna, not teaching now, but collaborating. Ragna wanted to add a 3rd layer, more insulation, more wind resistance, more protection against the tearing that had nearly cost her the bridge during the storm. Bernd argued against it. More layers means more weight, he said. More weight means more strain on the main lines. More strain means faster wear, and faster wear means the bridge fails sooner. The bridge nearly failed because the covering tore. If you had more layers, the wind would have caught them like sails. The covering tore because it was flexible. It gave way in pieces instead of all at once. That is what saved you. So I should build weaker to survive? You should build smarter. There is a difference. Bernd sat down on a stump at the edge of the yard, his breath coming harder than it should have. Listen to me, Ragna. I have built bridges that were too strong. I have built bridges that were too heavy. I have built bridges that looked indestructible and came apart in the first real test because they had no give, no flex, no way to absorb the forces that hit them. The best structures are the ones that know how to fail. Know how to fail. Yes, they fail in pieces. They fail in ways that can be repaired. They fail slowly instead of all at once. Your bridge did that during the storm. The covering tore, but the skeleton held. The lashings broke, but the main line stayed taut. You lost parts, but you did not lose the whole. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. Ragna was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the crossing in the dark, the moment when the lashing snapped and she had nearly fallen. She thought about cutting the flapping hide free rather than letting it drag the whole span down. She thought about all the small failures that had kept the large failure from happening. You are saying I should not try to make it perfect. I'm saying perfection is a trap. The storm will always be stronger than what you build. The only question is whether you build something that can survive being weaker. Your bridge did. Do not ruin it by trying to make it invincible. She did not add the 3rd layer. On the last day of March, Bernd told her he was leaving. They were sitting in the cabin after supper, the fire burning low, the boys asleep in the loft. Bernd's cough had worsened over the 3 weeks of his stay, and there were nights when Ragna could hear him through the barn wall, the sound of a man fighting for breath. "I have kin near Sioux Falls," he said. "My brother's widow. She has offered me a warm room with a real stove, and someone to look after me when the coughing gets bad. You could stay here. We have room. You have room for a worker. You do not have room for an invalid." He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused from decades of labor. "I know what is happening to me, Ragna. The railroad work, the stone dust, the cold water, the years of breathing air that was not meant to be breathed. It catches up. It always catches up. Bernd, do not argue with me. I am not asking for permission. I am telling you what I have decided." He met her eyes. "You do not need me anymore. You have learned what I could teach you, and you have gone beyond it. The bridge is yours. The knowledge is yours. What you do with it now is not my concern. It is your concern. You made it possible. I made it possible for you to make it possible. There is a difference." He coughed, softer this time. Almost gentle. "When I'm gone, I want you to remember something. The design was never the true work. The true work was learning to see the storm before it arrived. You have that now. You have the eye. Whatever comes next, whatever you build, whatever you teach, that eye will guide you. Trust it." He left the next morning, his canvas sack over his shoulder, his boots crunching on the frozen road. Ragna watched him go, the way she had watched him go in December, but this time she knew he would not be coming back. She stood at the window until he disappeared over the rise. The bridge swayed gently in the wind. The silo stood solid against the spring sky. There are moments when loss arrives not as a blow, but as a silence, a space that opens where a voice used to be. Bernd Solheim had been in her life for less than 4 months, but he had given her something that would outlast any building, any bridge, any structure she might ever create. He had taught her to see, and seeing, once learned, could not be unlearned. She went outside and crossed the bridge to the silo. She climbed down into the stone belly where her supplies waited, and she stood in the cool dark, breathing the stillness, letting the silence settle around her. Then she climbed back up and went to work. The secondary crisis came in April. It began with smoke. Ragna was repairing a section of the bridge's covering when she saw it, a dark column rising from the northwest, too thick to be a cooking fire, too persistent to be a brush burn. She stopped working and watched it grow, calculating distance and direction. The Hendricksons. The smoke was coming from the Hendricksons' property. She ran inside, told Niels to watch his brother, and set out on foot at a pace that made her lungs burn. The road was muddy from the spring thaw, and the mud sucked at her boots with every step. By the time she reached the Hendrickson claim, half an hour had passed and the smoke had become a pillar reaching toward the clouds. Their barn was burning. The fire had started in the hay storage. A lantern knocked over, perhaps, or a spark from the forge where Carl Hendrickson repaired his tools. The flames had spread to the rafters, then to the walls, and now the whole structure was engulfed. Carl and his wife were hauling water from the well in buckets too small to make a difference. "The animals!" Carl shouted when he saw Rana. "The horses are still inside." The barn doors were blocked by burning debris. The smoke was thick enough to taste. But there was another way in, the hay door on the second level, the door that opened onto nothing because the barn had been built before Carl could afford a proper loading platform. Ragna looked at the burning barn. She looked at the hay door 20 feet off the ground. She looked at the panic on Carl's face. "Do you have rope?" she asked. "In the cabin, 30 feet, maybe more." "Get it, and a ladder. The longest you have." While Carl ran for the supplies, Ragana circled the barn, looking for anchor points. The fire was hottest on the north side, where the hay storage had been. The south wall was scorched but not yet burning. There was a beam jutting from the roofline, a support for a pulley system that had never been installed, and it looked solid enough to hold weight. Carl returned with the rope and ladder. Ragna tied one end of the rope around her waist and handed the other end to him. "If I go in and do not come out in 2 minutes, pull." "You cannot go in there. The smoke alone will kill you." "I'm not going in. I'm going across." She pointed at the hay door. "Set the ladder against the south wall. I climb to the roof. I cross to the beam. I swing down to the door. The horses are in the stalls below the door. If I can get the door open, they will run." "That is insane." "It is what I know how to do." She climbed the ladder. The heat hit her halfway up, radiating from the walls like a living thing. She reached the roof line and pulled herself onto the shingles, which were hot enough to feel through her boots. The beam jutted out 6 feet ahead of her, solid oak, black with smoke, but not yet burning. She crawled to the beam. She gripped it with both hands. She swung her legs off the roof and hung in the air, 20 feet above the ground, with fire roaring below her. The hay door was 3 feet to her left. She swung toward it once, twice, building momentum. On the third swing, she let go, and for one terrible moment she was falling through smoke and heat and the roar of flames. And then her hands caught the door frame. She pulled herself through. The inside of the barn was a nightmare of smoke and light, the flames casting shadows that danced like demons. She could hear the horses screaming below, trapped in stalls that were still untouched by fire but filling rapidly with smoke. She found the stall latches by feel, wooden pegs, the kind that lifted with a pull. She freed the first horse, then the second. They bolted past her, knocking her against the wall, their hooves thundering on the floorboards as they ran for the open hay door and the fresh air beyond. She followed them out. The drop from the hay door was 15 feet. She hung from the frame, her arms screaming with strain, and let go. She hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up coughing, her lungs full of smoke, her hands blistered from the heat of the beam. But she was alive. And the horses were alive. And Carl Hendrickson was staring at her like she had just walked out of a burning building on a rope made of fire. "How did you—" he started. "I learned to see the path," she said, "even when the path is not on the ground." If this story reminds you why preparation matters, why seeing the problem before it arrives can save everything, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The barn was lost, but the horses survived, and the cabin survived, and the family's root cellar, the one they had connected to their house with the bridge Ragna had helped them build, remained intact with all their supplies. "If we had lost the root cellar," Carl said 2 days later, standing in the ashes of his barn, "we would have had nothing, no seed for spring planting, no food to last until the first harvest. We would have had to leave. But you did not lose it. Because of the bridge, because we could reach it even when the fire was burning." He shook his head slowly. "You saved my horses with a rope and a beam. You saved my family with a bridge and a cellar. I do not know how to repay you. Teach someone else what you learned. That is payment enough." Word of the barn rescue spread faster than word of the blizzard's survival. By late April, people were coming to Ragna's property from claims she had never heard of, asking questions, wanting to see the bridge, wanting to learn. Some were homesteaders like herself, struggling to survive their first or second Dakota winter. Others were more established, farmers with livestock, merchants with inventory, people who had resources to protect and no way to protect them when the ground route failed. She taught them all. She showed them the anchor principles. She showed them the tension system. She showed them how to think about angle and clearance, and the kind of failure that saves instead of destroys. She drew diagrams. She walked properties. She answered the same questions over and over because each person needed to hear the answers in their own way before they could understand. Harlan Voss brought her a gift in May, a proper surveying level, the kind that could calculate angle precisely instead of relying on eyeball estimates. "You are doing the territory a service," he said, handing her the instrument. "The least I can do is give you the tools to do it better." "This is expensive." "It is less expensive than the losses we have all suffered because no one thought to build the way you build." He looked at the bridge, swaying gently in the spring breeze. "I told you once that I had never seen anyone think the way you think. I was wrong. I had seen it. I just did not recognize it. Your father thought this way. The Norwegian who taught you thought this way. There are people all over this territory who would think this way if someone showed them how. I am trying. I know you are, and I am telling you, keep trying. What you are building here is more than a bridge. It is a way of seeing. And the more people who learn to see this way, the fewer graves we will dig when the next storm comes." Amos Creed's position continued to erode. He had tried, after the storm, to sell what he called ready-made storm passages, prefabricated kits of lumber and hardware that customers could assemble themselves. The kits were expensive, poorly designed, and built by workers who had never seen Ragna's bridge or understood the principles behind it. The first one, sold to a family near Volga, collapsed in a moderate wind, the anchor points pulling free because Creed's workers had bolted into weak timber instead of finding strong points. Word spread. Sales stopped, and Creed's reputation, which had been built on the perception that he knew what frontier families needed, began to crack. By June, he was no longer the only merchant in the county. A new store had opened in Brookings, run by a man who had learned carpentry in Sweden and understood load-bearing structures. The new store sold materials, not kits, and offered advice based on principles rather than salesmanship. People began to drift away from Creed's operation. "He came to see me yesterday," Marta reported during one of her regular visits to Ragna's cabin. "Wanted to know if I would put in a good word for him with the families who have been coming to you for teaching." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that putting in good words was not my business. I told him that if he wanted good words, he should earn them by doing good work." Marta smiled, a sharp expression that held no warmth. He did not like that. "I imagine not." "He is scared, Ragna. You have done something he never thought possible. You have made people trust their own judgment instead of his recommendations. You have made them see that they can build for themselves, learn for themselves, survive for themselves without paying him for the privilege. He does not know how to compete with that. He does not have to compete. He could learn. He could change. Some people cannot change. Some people are too attached to what they have always been." Marta looked out the window at the bridge. "But you are not one of those people, and neither am I. And neither are the families who are building bridges now instead of waiting for someone to sell them permission to survive." Summer arrived like a reprieve. The snow was gone. The roads had dried. The fields that had lain buried under white for 5 months were now showing the first green shoots of prairie grass, and the air smelled of turned earth and growing things. Ragna stood at the edge of her property on a June morning and watched the sun rise over land that had tried to kill her and failed. The bridge looked different in summer. Without the snow to justify it, the structure seemed almost absurd, a covered passage stretching between 2 buildings across a yard that anyone could walk in 30 seconds. The boys crossed it for fun now, Niels racing Eli from one end to the other, their laughter echoing inside the hide-in-canvas tunnel. They had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully understood, that the bridge had been built to save their lives. Ragna had not forgotten. She checked the main lines every week, testing the tension, looking for wear. She inspected the anchor points monthly, watching for the small shifts that could become large failures. She kept the covering repaired, patching the sections that had been damaged by spring storms, replacing the rawhide lashings that had dried and cracked in the warming air. The bridge would be ready when winter came again. It would always be ready. The first anniversary of Peder's death passed quietly. Ragna walked to the grave on the rise behind the cabin and stood there for a long time, looking at the cairn of stones that marked where her husband lay. The boys had gathered wildflowers, black-eyed Susans and prairie cone flowers, and laid them against the rocks. The wind moved through the grass in waves that made the whole hillside seem to breathe. "I finished your tower," she said aloud. "I built something you never imagined. I kept our boys alive." The wind answered. The stones did not. She walked back to the cabin and found Niels waiting for her at the door. "Mama," he said, "there's a man here. He says he wants to talk about hardware." Ivar Nesheim was not what she expected. He was tall and quiet, with hands that bore the burns and calluses of forge work, and eyes that seemed to measure everything they looked at. He had come to Dakota from Minnesota 3 years earlier, following rumors of iron deposits that had never materialized, and had stayed because the territory needed blacksmiths more than it needed prospectors. His shop in Brookings was small but well regarded, and he had a reputation for building things that lasted. "I made some of your hardware," he said, standing in her yard with his hat in his hands. "The eye bolts, the washers, the fittings for your anchor system. My apprentice did the work, but I approved the specifications. I remember the blacksmith in town. I traded butter and hens. 2 hens and a crock of butter. I still have the crock." He looked at the bridge. "I heard what you built with those fittings. I heard it survived the January blizzard when nothing else did. I wanted to see it for myself." "You have seen it now." "I have seen the outside. I would like to see the engineering." Ragna studied him. There was something in his face that she recognized. The same expression Bernd had worn when he first arrived. The expression of a craftsman encountering work that challenged his assumptions. "Come up, then." She led him to the silo platform and showed him the anchor system, the iron bolts Peder had set, the bracing she had added, the way the load distributed across multiple points instead of concentrating on one. Ivar examined each joint carefully, testing the connections with fingers that knew metal the way hers knew rope. "This is good work," he said finally. "Better than good. The load spread is elegant. Most people would have driven a single large bolt and trusted it to hold. You understood that one point of failure is the same as certain failure." "Bernd taught me that, the man who helped me." "Railroad bridges? How did you know?" "Because this is bridge engineering, not farm engineering. The principles are different. Farmers build heavy and trust the weight to hold. Bridge builders know that weight is the enemy. They build light and distribute the strain." He straightened and looked at her. "I have seen 100 homestead adaptations in 3 years. Sheds, cellars, lean-tos, every kind of jury-rigged shelter you can imagine. I have never seen anything like this." "It is just a bridge." "It is not just a bridge. It is a solution to a problem no one else thought to solve." He put his hat back on. "I would like to help you improve it." "Improve it how?" "The fittings, the anchor bolts, the washers, the load-bearing hardware. What you have works, but it could work better. I can forge fittings that distribute strain more evenly, that resist rust, that last longer under repeated stress. I can make hardware specifically designed for elevated winter passages instead of hardware adapted from other purposes. And what do you want in return? To learn what you know, to understand how you think about these structures, so that when other people come to me asking for hardware, I can help them build something that works instead of something that fails. Ragna considered this. It was a fair trade. His skill for her knowledge, his mettle for her method. And there was something in his directness that she appreciated, the absence of flattery or false modesty. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "Bring your tools. We will start with the main line attachments." Ivar came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. They worked together through July and into August, redesigning the hardware that held the bridge together. Ivar forged new anchor fittings with wider bearing surfaces that spread the load more evenly across the stone. He built improved tensioning mechanisms that allowed the main lines to be adjusted without disassembling the anchor points. He created reinforced slat brackets that held the treadway boards in place without the constant need for relashing. They disagreed often. Ivar thought in metal, hard angles, precise tolerances, connections that did not move. Ragna thought in rope and hide, flexibility, give, the kind of controlled failure that Berendt had taught her to value. Their arguments were technical rather than personal, but they were frequent and sometimes loud. "The fitting does not need to flex," Ivar said, one afternoon when they were debating the design of a new anchor bracket. "Metal is strong because it is rigid. If you want flex, use rope. Metal that does not flex breaks when the load exceeds what it was designed for. Rope that flexes absorbs shock. I need the fitting to allow the rope to flex, not to prevent it." "Then why use metal at all?" "Because rope needs something to attach to. Because anchor points must hold firm while the lines between them move. The fitting is not the structure. The fitting is the connection between structures that behave differently." Ivar was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "The connection between structures that behave differently," he repeated. "I had not thought of it that way. The fitting is a translator, not a component." "Something like that. Then it needs to be designed as a translator. Hard where it meets the stone, but with allowance where it meets the rope." He picked up his chalk and began sketching on the workbench. "What if the bearing surface rotated? A pivot, not a fixed point. The stone anchor stays rigid, but the rope attachment can move within a range without putting shear stress on the bolt." They worked on the design until dark. By the end of the evening, they had sketched something neither of them could have created alone. A fitting that combined Ivar's precision with Ragna's understanding of how flexible structures behaved under load. "This is good," Ivar said, looking at the drawing. "This is better than what either of us brought to the table." "It usually is," Ragna said, "when people work together instead of insisting they already know the answer." The summer passed in a rhythm of work and teaching and slow improvement. Families continued to arrive, seeking knowledge. Ragna showed them what she had learned, and now Ivar showed them what he was learning: how to order the right hardware, what specifications to ask for, how to test fittings before trusting them with lives. The operation that had begun as one woman's desperate innovation was becoming something larger. Not a business. Ragna still refused to charge for teaching, but a network, a web of knowledge spreading across the county, connecting homesteads that had been isolated, giving families tools they had never known they needed. By August, Ragna estimated that 30 structures had been built using principles she had helped develop. Not all were bridges. Some were reinforced cellar accesses. Others were improved barn connections. A few were elevated storage platforms that kept supplies above probable drift lines. But all of them shared the same foundation: strong anchor points, distributed loads, controlled failure, and the understanding that the ground was not the only way to move. "You are changing how people think about winter," Marta said during one of her visits. Not just how they build, how they think. Burnt changed how I thought. I'm just passing it on. Stop being modest. It does not suit you. Marta smiled, taking the sting from her words. Burnt taught you principles. You turned those principles into something anyone can learn. That is not passing on, that is creating. And what you have created is making this territory safer. I hope so. I know so. The Hendricksons survived that barn fire because of what you taught them. The Olsons kept their livestock fed through a late spring blizzard because their bridge let them reach the barn when the yard was impassable. The Larsons built their new homestead with bridge points already designed in, and they have not lost a single day of access since they arrived. Marta leaned forward. These are not small things, Ragna. These are lives. These are futures. You gave them tools, and they built their own survival with those tools. Ragna said nothing, but something in her chest loosened, a knot she had not known she was carrying. In September, word came that Bernd Solheim had died. A letter arrived from his brother's widow in Sioux Falls, written in a careful hand that spoke of education and sorrow. Bernd had passed in his sleep on the first day of the month, his lungs finally giving out after years of slow decline. He had asked to be buried in Dakota, in the territory where he had done his last teaching, and the widow wanted to know if Ragna could recommend a place. She wrote back with directions to the rise behind her cabin, where Peter lay under his cairn of stones. If the widow agreed, if it was not too much trouble, Bernd could rest beside the man whose tower he had helped make useful. The burial happened in late September, on a day when the sky was so blue it hurt to look at, and the wind carried the first hints of coming cold. Ragna stood at the graveside with her boys, with Marta and Arvid Ellingson, with Harlan Voss and Carl Hendrickson, and a dozen other families who had learned from the old Norwegian without ever meeting him. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that the gathered crowd did not already know. Bernd Solheim had come to Dakota looking for work and had stayed to teach a widow how to see. He had died knowing that what he taught had saved lives, had spread beyond the single student he had taken on, had become something larger than himself. It was, Ragna thought, not a bad way to be remembered. Amos Creed's final humiliation came with the first snow. The October storms arrived early that year, dropping 3 feet of wet snow in 2 days and blocking roads across the county. Creed's store, which sat on the main street of the settlement, was accessible enough. The town cleared the roads quickly. But his own residence, a large frame house he had built on a hill outside town, was a different matter. The house sat at the end of a long drive that drifted shut within hours of any significant snowfall. Creed had never thought to build elevated access to his outbuildings, because he had always hired men to dig him out. But the hired men were busy with their own properties this year, and the ones who were available had heard enough about Creed's business practices that they were not eager to help him. He came to Ragna's property on the 3rd day of the storm. She was in the barn, adjusting the tension on a new line she was testing, a shorter span, only 15 feet, designed for smaller homesteads that needed bridge access, but did not have the distance that her own property required. She heard the wagon on the road and came out to find Creed climbing down, his face red from cold and something that might have been shame. "Mrs. Tveit," he said. "Mr. Creed." "I need your help." Ragna waited. "My house. The drive is blocked. I cannot reach my smokehouse, my woodshed, my—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I cannot reach anything. I have been burning furniture for 2 days. My wife is threatening to leave me if I do not find a solution." "What kind of solution are you looking for?" "I need—" He swallowed. "I need someone to show me how to build what you have built, an elevated passage, a bridge." Ragna looked at him. The man who had called her contraption a fool's errand, the man who had told her paper moves faster than mules, the man who had tried to sell defective kits and extended her debt when he thought she would fail. You came to me, she said. Not to the carpenter in town, not to Ivor Nesheim, to me. You are the one who knows. Everyone knows you are the one who knows. And what happened to the kits you were selling, the ready-made storm passages? Creed's face darkened. They did not work. You know they did not work. The design was wrong, and He stopped again. When he continued, his voice was quieter. I did not understand what I was selling. I thought it was just lumber and hardware. I did not understand that there was thinking behind your design that I had not bothered to learn. And now? Now I'm standing in your yard, asking you to teach me, because my wife is cold and my woodshed is inaccessible, and I have no other options. He met her eyes. I am not proud of how I have treated you, Mrs. Tveit. I am not proud of the things I said, but I am asking anyway, because pride is not as important as heat, and I have neither at the moment. Ragnar was quiet for a long time. She thought about the October day when he had come to her yard and told her that her bridge would fail. She thought about the January storm when his predictions had been proven wrong. She thought about all the families he had tried to sell defective kits to, all the claims he had tried to acquire through debt manipulation, all the small cruelties of a man who saw the frontier as a market rather than a community. I will teach you, she said finally, but I have conditions. Name them. First, you pay what the teaching is worth, not to me, to the families you sold bad kits to. You make them whole for what they lost. That will cost. I do not care what it costs. That is the first condition. Creed's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Second, behind her, she heard Creed standing in the cold, probably working through the calculations of what she had demanded versus what he stood to lose. She did not look back. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened slowly. Ivor continued to come to the property through the autumn and into the winter, working on hardware improvements, helping Ragnar test new designs. They argued about metal and rope, about rigidity and flexibility, about the principles that made structures survive. They ate meals together when the work ran late. They talked about their pasts, his failed prospecting venture, her years in Wisconsin, the people they had lost and the things they had learned from losing them. There was no moment when it became something more. There was only a gradual recognition that they had become partners in something that extended beyond engineering. I am not proposing, Ivor said one evening in February, when they were sitting by her fire after a long day of work. I want to be clear about that. I am not proposing because I do not think you would say yes. Why do you think that? Because you built this. He gestured at the cabin, at the bridge visible through the window, at everything she had created in the year since Petter's death. You built it alone. You kept your family alive alone. You changed how an entire county thinks about winter construction alone. A woman who can do all that does not need a man to complete her. No, I do not need that. But you might want a partner. He looked at her. Someone who understands what you have built. Someone who wants to help you build more, not to take over, not to manage, just to work beside you. If you wanted that, I would be interested. Ragnar was quiet for a long time. She thought about Pater, who had dreamed the silo and left it for her to finish. She thought he built his own bridge when he claimed a homestead in '94, a longer span than his mother's, but using the same principles, and he taught the families around him the way she had taught families around her. Eli became a teacher of a different kind. He went east for schooling and returned with a certificate that let him stand in front of classrooms, and he taught children in Brookings and the surrounding settlements for 40 years. He never built a bridge himself, but he told the story of his mother's bridge to every class he taught, and the children who heard him grew up knowing that a woman with $12 and 2 boys and no team had changed how a territory survived winter. Ivor expanded his forge into a proper ironworks, employing 3 men by 1900 and he developed a line of hardware specifically designed for elevated winter passages. The fittings were sold across the Dakotas and into Minnesota and Nebraska, and every box carried a small stamp that read Tveit Nesheim Design. Ragna never stopped teaching. She taught until her hands grew too stiff to tie knots, and her eyes grew too dim to judge her angles. And even then she sat in her chair by the window and told people what to do while Ivor or Nails did the actual work. The families she had taught in those first desperate years became teachers themselves, spreading the knowledge further than she could have spread it alone. By 1910, when she was 54 years old, and South Dakota had been a state for 2 decades, someone counted and estimated that more than 200 elevated winter passages had been built using principles that trace back to her original bridge. The number was probably low. It was hard to count something that people built in their own yards without permits or announcements, simply because they had learned that it worked. Ragna Tveit died in the winter of 1923, 67 years old, in the cabin that Pater had framed and that she had spent 36 years improving. The bridge was still there. It had been rebuilt so many times that nothing of the original remained except the anchor points on the silo, the iron bolts Pater had set before his death, still holding firm, still bearing the load they had been designed to bear. Ivor had died 3 years earlier, and Niels was running the homestead now, and Eli had come back from Brookings to sit beside his mother's bed in the final days. She was not afraid. She had built something that would outlast her, taught something that would spread beyond her reach, and raise sons who would carry forward what she had learned. There was peace in that. There was completion. The morning she died, the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, and the wind was howling from the northwest, piling drifts against the cabin walls. Eli crossed the bridge at dawn to fetch water from the silo. The slats were solid under his boots. The covering muffled the wind. The main lines held taut despite the cold, the hardware that his stepfather had forged still doing its job after decades of use. When he returned with the water, his mother was gone. Within 5 years of Ragna Tveit's death, more than 200 families across the northern Great Plains had built elevated winter passages using principles she had developed and taught. The structures went by many names: storm bridges, drift crossings, winter hallways. But the people who built them knew where the knowledge came from. They knew about the widow who had arrived in Dakota Territory with $12 and 2 boys and a stone tower that her husband had left unfinished. They knew about the blizzard that had buried the territory and the bridge that had held when nothing else did. They told the story to their children, and their children told it to theirs, and the knowledge spread the way useful knowledge always spreads, not through books or schools, but through hands and voices and the practical wisdom of people who had learned that survival was a skill that could be taught. Ragna Tveit lived out her life on the same South Dakota homestead where she had buried her first husband and built her first bridge. She saw the territory become a state, saw her sons become men, saw the principles she had learned from a wandering railroad worker transform how an entire region thought about winter construction. When she died, she was buried on the rise behind her cabin, beside Peter Tveit and Bernd Solheim, the 3 of them resting together in ground that had tried to kill them all and failed. January 12th, 1888. The temperature dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. The snow buried the cabin doors. The yard became impassable, and families across the territory found themselves trapped inside their own homes, unable to reach supplies they could see from their windows. Harlan Voss had told her, "Your boys will freeze to death looking at your firewood from a window." But Ragna Tveit had built a hallway in the sky, and when the storm came, she crossed it, in the dark, in the wind, in the killing cold, and she carried heat and water and life from one end to the other while the whole world disappeared beneath her feet. The bridge swayed in the wind. The lantern moved through the covered passage. And somewhere above the drift, a woman walked the path she had built with her own hands, proving that the ground was not the only way, that the impossible was only impossible until someone did it, and that sometimes the mad solution was the only one that worked.